All right. Hello, everyone. I am Diego Torres, and this is how JupyterLab 4 is strategic to Sigma and you. And before we start, a disclaimer regarding the content of the presentation. Specifically, this presentation does not contain any financial or investment advice. If that's what you're looking for, you're probably in the wrong building or in the wrong YouTube channel. I don't see a camera. I don't know if this one is recorded. Here's some other important information, or more like big disclaimers related to this talk. Basically, I haven't slept in like 24 hours. And also, last time I gave this talk live at PyData New York, there was a support incident, and my whole team was at the talk. So today, please keep an eye on our Slack channel while we're here. All right, so moving on. What does this talk actually contain? So there are some introductions at the beginning. Then there's also our partnerships contributions to JupyterLab around performance and real-time collaboration. And there's also some discussion of why I think this partnership is a good way to contribute to Jupyter for an organization, of course. And some takeaways from the talk, hopefully, will be that you go and try JupyterLab 4 when it's released. It's going to be great. Or just try the beta or the release candidate. They've been around for a while. Also, I want to encourage you to encourage your org or just your colleagues to update JupyterLab often, and also encourage you to encourage your org to contribute to Jupyter. All right, so as stated, some introductions. I'm Diego. The arrows above explain Hispanic naming conventions in case it's confusing that my name is so long. My pronouns are he and him. I have been an engineering manager at 2 Sigma for the last year and a half, and I was previously a software engineer for 5 years, also at 2 Sigma. I'm also very involved in the PyData New York City community. And aside from any questions about this presentation, please also say hi to me in the hallway if you're also from Mexico. You have fun tips for a COVID bicycle boom enthusiast, or if you're interested in getting involved in the New York City Python or PyData community, I'd love to tell you about my experience and introduce you to some folks over there. And also, some of the feedback in the dry run for this talk was that I was going too slow, so this is why I'm also going very fast. All right, so before we move on, I'd like to explain what my employer, 2 Sigma, does and why we care so much about Jupyter. So 2 Sigma is a financial sciences company. We basically combine rigorous inquiry and data analysis to solve the toughest challenges across financial services. This means that our data scientists spend a lot of time doing research, and today, most of our research happens in Python, specifically inside of Jupyter. Every month, our internal JupyterLab distribution reaches about 500 distinct users, which is about 25% of the size of the whole company. And obviously, the heaviest users of Jupyter at the firm are our data scientists, who are hard at work on those tough challenges in finance. This means that a lot of the firm's productive time is spent inside of JupyterLab, which means we care about every single little detail of the user experience and its performance. And naturally, all of our researchers are also always looking for the best way to collaborate with each other. A good amount of our internal extensions are meant to help our users share their notebook. So that is a part of Jupyter that we really care about as well. All right, so 2 Sigma is a medium-sized company. We employ around 1,000 engineers. But they're also busy doing all sorts of things, maintaining data centers, building storage systems, operating services, et cetera, et cetera. Realistically, we cannot spend too much time contributing to Jupyter. In Jupyter's specific case, throughout 2022, we allocated about 0.5 full-time engineers to work on that internal distribution. But it was mostly spent resolving bugs to our internal extensions, not really upstreaming things to Jupyter, although I wish that was the case. So just like Jupyter, there are many other open source tools that we rely on, and although they really help boost our productivity, realistically, we cannot contribute too much of our times to any specific one of them. And pitching in to contribute with such a small amount of resources can be very daunting. And I think this is a relatively common problem, which can make an even medium-sized company feel like a small fish in a vast ocean. But actually, if you go check the list of sponsors for JupyterCon or PyData or any similar conference, yes, there are many massive corporations, but actually you'll find that the majority are small or medium-sized companies like us. And I bet that many of them, most of them, if they're sponsoring a conference like this one, they probably care a lot about at least one very niche Jupyter feature or issue that they depend on, but feel that they're not big enough to make a significant impact in Jupyter development. Essentially, they feel like a small fish in a big tank. So for the rest of the talk, I'll tell you about a partnership that helped 2 Sigma deliver a big contributions to Jupyter, and why we think that partnership really worked well and made sense, and why we think it's a good model to follow for similar companies. All right, and another introduction. So our partner in this effort is QuantStack. QuantStack is a team of developers and contributors of major open source projects for scientific computing who are passionate about science and technology, and this obviously and of course includes Jupyter. So throughout the last 2 years, 2 Sigma has worked with QuantStack to make contributions to JupyterLab, and this collaboration has allowed our internal software engineers to focus on our internal extensions to Jupyter and other internal software, while QuantStack's experts focus on making improvements to open source JupyterLab, specifically around the issues and themes that 2 Sigma really cares about. So before we go any further, I want to give proper recognition to our friends from the QuantStack team. They're the ones that did all of the actual work and put actual hands to keyboard. I believe most of them are here at JupyterCon, so if you see them, give them your kudos and go to their talks. Many of them are talking. I think several of them are talking at multiple talks, so go to all of them. All right, so enough with introductions. Let me get to the first meaty part of the presentation. What have we accomplished together? This is the part of the talk that will be very interesting to you if you just care about what's new in Jupyter. So throughout 2021 and 2022, we worked on 2 specific things: performance and real-time collaboration. Let me talk about performance first. And let's start by mentioning some of the bigger pain points that our researchers at 2 Sigma had using Jupyter. So the top one we heard all the time is working on a large notebook is very slow. Also, scrolling around in such notebooks, but also in general in JupyterLab, can be slow and jittery. And this is common feedback for any web application. Any small delay in the UI can be disruptive, even if it's small. And we also obviously discovered that these pet peeves are not really specific to 2 Sigma. And it makes sense that in general, users want things like tab switching to be very fast. So we knew from the start that improvements in these areas would be a win for everyone, not just 2 Sigma. So here I'm showing you 3 open issues on GitHub, or at least they were open as of November last year. And they refer to the same problems that 2 Sigma has, but found by others. These were not reported by us. Note that they all have a lot of comments and long discussions between users and developers. So, when you're a developer at a small or a medium-sized company, you look at this, you look at the number of comments, and the first thing that comes to mind is, oh, this is probably something a core developer needs to take care of instead of me, an external contributor. All right, so where did we start with our work? The very first thing that QuantStack did was we created benchmarks for the user operations that we wanted to improve. But these benchmarks are also useful for Jupyter developers, and they are now part of the PR process. Whenever someone creates PR, there's a little bot that runs these benchmarks and shows any differences. And I'll tell you a little bit more about exactly what they are in a little bit. All right, so moving on to the actual improvements that we made that are measurable in those benchmarks. So QuantStack implemented virtual rendering. So what is that? It essentially means that JupyterLab should only have to draw the UI elements that are visible on the screen at a given point in time, not everything that is in the notebook. This is very similar to the infinite scroll feature that you probably know from social media sites, where rendering a timeline does not require loading every single post on the timeline. Why did we do this? Very simple. After this change, rendering time is now bounded by the amount of visible cells, not the total cell count. So it doesn't matter if your notebook is big. It also doesn't matter if your notebook has a lot of very complex outputs. It just matters, like, what's the complexity of the cell output that's currently in view right now. All right, so what are the results of this work? This very first plot shows you how long it takes to open a notebook with a lot of cells that contain Python. This is the same thing, but a notebook with a lot of markdown cells. And these next two plots are how long it takes to switch to a tab with one of those notebooks open. So on the left, a lot of code cells. On the right, a lot of markdown cells. And essentially, each, I guess, quarter of this image, each quadrant shows two box plots. That's the before and after. Put in actual numbers. Those are the gains that we saw in those benchmarks after implementing virtual rendering. So things like tab switching improved by 57%, and opening a notebook with a lot of code cells improved by 75%. These are obviously massive improvements. All right. But as they say these days, a video is worth more than 1,000 plots. So let me show you a quick video that our QuantStack friend Frederick recorded. So on the left, he has a JupyterLab instance using virtual rendering, and on the right, he has one without. Both browser windows were just refreshed, and they have a very large notebook open. And what we're seeing is that the virtual rendering version on the left is basically done, and the unmodified one on the right is taking its sweet time, doing some weird things, and there's some slightly erratic behavior. And at this point, you've probably switched into your tab with a lot of memes and just completely lost track of what you were doing. OK. So that's it for virtual rendering. What's other stuff that we implemented? Another big improvement was an upgrade of Jupyter from CodeMirror 5 to CodeMirror 6. If you're not familiar with CodeMirror, it's an open source code editor for web applications. Essentially, it's what JupyterLab uses as the editor for every single cell. It's in charge of displaying everything the user types into cells, but also a lot of the complexity around editing text inside Jupyter. That includes things like the Vim key bindings, like source highlighting and formatting. Version 6 introduced a lot of performance improvements because it's a from-scratch re-implementation of all of CodeMirror. And it also paves the way for bringing CodeMirror's new accessibility features into Jupyter. And once more, here are the benchmarks for this change. Very big improvements for opening notebooks with a lot of code and opening notebooks with a lot of markdown, but especially code. And that is because code is much more complex to render because of syntax highlighting, et cetera, et cetera. All right, another improvement. So there used to be a misalignment between the protocol used to communicate between the Jupyter server, the browser, and the notebook kernel. The Jupyter server is often just an intermediary between the two. For example, when you run a cell and you want to pass the outputs from the server from the kernel to the browser, the server is just like passing the message along. But because the protocol was not aligned, it meant that the server had to parse every single message and reserialize it, essentially. After this change, the server in all of those cases can simply act as a forwarder of all of those messages. And it depends. The improvement depends on exactly what is being rendered. But in some tests that we ran where we're passing a very large output table, we saw improvements where the speed-up factor was as much as 20x. So again, depends on exactly what you're passing, but can be a massive improvement if you're working with a very complex notebook. All right, so that is performance. Let's talk about real-time collaboration for a second. So what is real-time collaboration? It is a recent feature in JupyterLab that is still under active development. It is essentially when you have multiple users all working on a single Jupyter instance, all working on the same notebook. Think of multiple cursors showing you who is writing where, who wrote which comments, who made which suggestions, etc. I'm sure you're familiar with some office tooling that does something like this. So I don't want to go into too much detail about RTC. I just want to show you the kind of work that we accomplished together. So Carlos and David, two of the engineers from QuantStack that worked on RTC, are giving a talk entirely focused on RTC tomorrow at noon. So I encourage you to attend that if you want more details about this whole new feature. OK, so let me walk you very quickly through 3 contributions we made as part of this partnership. The first one is that we implemented per cell collaborator lists. So you can see who is editing a cell. This is just literally showing you where people are in the notebook. Together, we also implemented the collaborator panel, which shows you who has made changes to the notebook historically. And we also implemented the undo redo history so that it is per cell. This might sound kind of unrelated to real-time collaboration, but imagine how chaotic a collaborative experience would get if the undo and redo history was over the whole notebook and you had multiple people working on it simultaneously. It would be an absolute disaster. All right, so what is left in the RTC space? It's under active development. I highly recommend talking to those folks tomorrow if you want the latest update. But essentially, for 2 Sigma, there's still one very important piece missing, which is authentication. RTC is not really yet in a state where you can deploy it in your organization because, an organization is probably going to want to know who is who made what change, etc. So for now, this means that every collaborator has an air of mystery around them with those weird names on the left. Now, raise your hand if you know what orthosi, I don't know how to pronounce this, or any of those words on the left is. And this is JupyterCon, so I think at least one person will know yes. That is correct. Those are the moons of Jupiter. There are currently 80 known satellites according to Wikipedia, so that should be enough for 80 people in the same notebook. Don't go beyond that, or I don't really know what happens. OK, so that's all the features that we implemented together that I wanted to highlight. Now let me talk a little bit more about the partnership and how we accomplish these things together and how your organization can do so too. So first, let's think about the question at the top for a second. Why not just do it ourselves? Why won't 2 Sigma just hire a bunch of people and do all of this? So I showed you this number at the beginning. That's the size of our engineering organization. I'm sure many of you thought that I'm a crazy person for saying that we're a medium-sized company. Some of you may be thinking, certainly more than 0.5 of those 1,000 engineers could be working on Jupyter. And the answer is, kind of. We actually want to grow that 0.5 number. But once we do, it would still be hard to have this kind of impact. The changes I just described require very large changes to Jupyter code bases. Some of them are downright re-architecting major components of Jupyter. So it is very hard to accomplish, actually, without multiple members of the core developer team involved. Also, this kind of work requires going through 2 very steep learning curves. The first one is kind of obvious. There is a technical learning curve to becoming a prolific contributor to a code base like Jupyter. Especially for 2 Sigma, the stack that Jupyter is built on is not really common. Ultimately, there are not a lot of people, for example, with a lot of UX expertise at 2 Sigma. It's not one thing we have to do a lot. So that's one of the challenges for 2 Sigma. But there's also a big curve when it comes to having the social and community connections required to make this kind of change happen. While we know that something that, something like improving performance is something all of the community wants to do, it's still challenging for a company to figure out which of the possible ways to accomplish this are actually well aligned with the direction that the community wants to go in. And we don't want to spend a lot of time building something that we won't be able to get merged into upstream. And we also definitely don't want to try to push the community to solutions without a consensus. And that is a very challenging problem. I guess there's also always the option of hiring folks that have all of this expertise already. It's something that we have done before, but trust me, hiring for this kind of skill is very hard. We have done it, we actively do it, and it's not easy. So these challenges are why we think having a partner like QuantStack with all of this expertise already in the ranks is the best way to go. Okay, so how does the partnership actually work? It starts with a statement of work document with specific focus areas that 2 Sigma cares about in the Jupyter space. Obviously, our relationship with a vendor starts with a statement of work. What I'm trying to communicate is more that the statement of work is kind of vague. It says work on improving performance, work on improving real-time collaboration. It's not very prescriptive about how to do it. This is where we trust a group of developers like QuantStack that has all of that expertise, all of those social connections in the Jupyter space to help us figure out how to get to that goal. So this is going a little bit more into the details of our partnership. Having this partnership has not only allowed us to address things ahead of time and plan for them, it has also allowed us to address internal issues that come up in a more immediate way. So we at this point have had a few successes where someone in our internal Slack channel has a question, our internal support engineer figures out, oh, this is actually a bug in upstream Jupyter. We reach out to our QuantStack partner to confirm that this is indeed a Jupyter issue, and QuantStack handles it from them. They create a GitHub issue, they create a PR, they have the proper discussions with the members of the community who care about this issue, and eventually we deliver a PR. All right, and another important part of our relationship is that QuantStack staff also helps us manage our internal Jupyter deployment. More importantly, they help us stay up to date with Jupyter, which is very important to make sure that our users actually get to use all of the shiny new things that we contribute to JupyterLab. But here is one very important caveat. So far, I have essentially said, just set up a working relationship with a bunch of Jupyter experts. They're going to solve all of your problems. But it's really just not that simple. There are things that your organization has to do to make this kind of relationship work. The most important one, in my opinion, by far, is staying up to date with Jupyter. And although I just said that QuantStack also helps us accomplish that, that will probably require changing some things in your workflow. It will probably require your users to change their behavior, or it will require some engineering work so that users don't have to worry about this problem. This is actually pretty tricky, and here's some information of how we do it at 2 Sigma. The most important step that we have done to accomplish this is we try to isolate the set of libraries or the environment, specifically the virtual environment in which Jupyter runs from the virtual environment that the user uses to manage their dependencies. And I've seen many cases where this is where people don't follow this practice, and I really think this is very important for you to be able to keep up to date with Jupyter without user disruptions. So essentially, you want the Jupyter kernels running in completely different environments. That way, for example, you can use one version of Jinja or Tornado in your notebooks, even if Jupyter requires a different version of them. And this may seem silly at first, do people use Jinja, Tornado, or other Jupyter dependencies in their notebooks? The answer is most definitely, absolutely, yes. Here's a very basic example. I don't know why I clicked there. I shouldn't have clicked there. A very basic example. Dask depends on Tornado, and you definitely don't want Jupyter telling you what version of Dask you can install. That is nuts. VS Code doesn't tell you what version of your libraries you can install. Don't ever do that. So the way we do that is it actually looks very similar to this extension called nbconda kernels. It's an extension that basically lets you see your conda environments in Jupyter. We have a very similar thing for our internal virtual environment solution that is not quite like conda, but kind of similar. And this means that QuantStack can help us upgrade Jupyter, and our internal engineers can upgrade Jupyter for everyone at the firm whenever we want, without breaking people's environments, without going and telling people run pip install Jupyter version blah 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 or -- upgrade or whatever. All right, so another tricky requirement here is, keeping Jupyter up to date is tricky in and of itself when you only have Jupyter. Internal and open source extensions can be really helpful. We've all done this before. We find a great extension with a very niche feature that we really like, and it dramatically improves our experience. But sadly, Jupyter extensions can also kind of be an anchor for upgrades. Sure, that nice extension that, I don't know, shows you cell execution times may be very nice, but hey, maybe it's not that actively well maintained, and maybe it lags like a few months behind JupyterLab in terms of upgrades, or like in terms of compatibility. So you really have to weigh those trade-offs. Is it really worth being 1 year behind JupyterLab improvements so that you can have X set of extensions installed for all of your users? So very tricky trade-off. I guess from experience, I can tell you that at 2 Sigma, we are now leaning towards upgrade agility rather than that specialization that many extensions give you. But we still give users the optionality to install their own extensions. It's just sort of like, you can install your own extensions, but we might upgrade you and they might not work. You might try to stay on the old version, but you're probably going to be less supported by our internal engineers. All right, so I'm running out of time here. So before we close, some reminders and takeaways from the talk. First, consider trying, oh man, it still says alphas there. So consider trying the JupyterLab 4 RC1, I think, is the latest one. This is where you will find most of the performance upgrades that I mentioned. You should also, if you don't want to do 4, at least upgrade to JupyterLab 3.6, which is the latest released. We did some of these changes. We backported them to 3.5 and 3.6, so you can definitely try them out there. Also, encourage your organization to update. It's going to be great for your users. It's also, I think, in general, good for the Jupyter project if all of the users are like on recent versions and reporting issues with the most recent versions. But more importantly, encourage your organization to contribute to the Jupyter project. I think our partnership is a good collaboration model, and hopefully this talk has shown you how that partnership could really work for you. And what's a good place to start if you're thinking about that? Check out the Jupyter community calendar. There are weekly team calls that you can join to sort of figure out what are ongoing efforts in the Jupyter community that maybe your organization really cares about and could pitch into. And especially the RTC effort is still ongoing. Development is very active. That's one great area to contribute into. And finally, 2 Sigma is hiring. The team that made this specific collaboration happen is hiring. And if this work sounded interesting to you and you're curious about what Jupyter development at a financial tech company looks like, come talk to me and I can pass you my email. Or if you're curious about other opportunities at the firm, check out 2sigma.com careers. We do have offices in New York, London, Houston, and a few other smaller offices in other places. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions about anything. Thank you. Yeah, is there a mic? Yes, no. Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Yeah, so we're not using it because of the authentication problems that I mentioned, but the use case that motivated us to contribute to that effort is the case where 2 researchers who are working on a similar vein of research want to share knowledge with each other and try different things on the same notebook. And this might be 2 folks who are on the same team and just work closely together generally, and are maybe just hopping on a call to do some work together. Or it could be, say, something slightly different, like an engineer being called to help out a data scientist who is running into like a very tricky engineering-y problem in their data science code. I do think like even the one-to-many case, the instructor-to-student case, is also something that you see at companies. My team, we own our internal Jupyter distribution. We also own a lot of research tools that our researchers use, and we have classes about how to use those tools. And I think RTC would be extremely helpful in those classroom settings that we do have inside the company. All of our researchers are using Jupyter, and the continued health of the project is important to us. We have seen what can happen when a lot of our users depend on a piece of open source software that gets deprecated or abandoned. We actually had a little taste of it with Jupyter Notebook, as opposed to Lab, where we started seeing less development on Notebook, but a lot of our internal users were like, I don't like this Lab thing. It sort of moved everything around. Can you guys go fix these things that we care about in Notebook? And we're like, I mean, it's kind of the community moving on. But back then we also had a core developer in our team, and that's the core developer that sort of helped revive the conversation on, okay, what do we do with Notebook now? Which is then now the plan to release Jupyter Notebook 7 with like the Lab backend, or like basically making Retro Notebook part of Lab. So yeah, I think like it really is about helping open source projects that we really depend on thrive. Yeah. No, I think like, there is definitely the, there's definitely an altruistic, motivation to it as well, and giving back to the community. But I think that the companies that are not doing this, they're just not seeing that there is a real business case for being very engaged with the community. Like I said, it's not about pushing the community in directions that the community doesn't want to go, but when you're one of the big players helping fund the work of developers on these projects, you do get a say in the direction of the project, and I think 2 Sigma has, and 2 Sigma has won for doing that. All right, thank you, everyone.